problem of consciousness always falls into this discussion about like how consciousness and matter are related. And I think that that's like a red herring, because I think that you fail to like step back from the real situation that's happening, which is that we're all just like in this phenomenological bubble, imagining things and then trying to like predict what the phenomenological bubble of something else is. If we do that, then we just fall into all sorts of issues. I'm watching a video from Michael Levin, and he's talking to this guy called Michael Johnson. And they're kind of discussing like the possible models or descriptions that we could use to like categorize and identify in a meaningful way consciousness. It's this thing that we don't have any certainty of except for in one instance, and that's ourselves, right? And so we can point to ourselves and make kind of the same conclusions about what's going on, right? So we have control schemes, we have modeling, we have state transitions, and we have functions based on stimulus inside of our brain, right? And so we're saying because, we have all that stuff and we're conscious, then it seems reasonable to then have at least like the hypothesis that there is some phenomenology within a perspective of the cell, right? Wherever that happens to exist in space and time in the same way that ours does. There's something innate to this object, to the material that makes up this object, that such that when it operates the way that it is operating, when we observe it as like an agent, the accumulation of that, lower panpsychist consciousness essence is now resulting in a higher order consciousness. But I think that's completely wrong. I think that, I think it's a framing problem. If we're going to be having some kind of functional description as being like the way that we categorize something as being conscious or not being conscious, then I think like a better framing that gives a more like robust world model about the substrate that things exist within. So we've stepped out of kind of any way of gesturing towards an objective thing to now gesturing towards like a subjective model about how metaphysics plays out. And the only purpose of this is so that we can communicate in some common informational medium between us that allows us to gesture towards this kind of metaphysical grasping in a non-dual way. So within this instantaneous and continuous, like unending, uncountable content that is known by existence, there is a human who is stretched out through it, right, in some particular way. And then at any particular like granularity, when we're looking at that person's existence as it's stretched out through that thing, if we just take some like segment out of it and then we inspect the functional behavior of that, what we're going to find is not like some phenomenological experience kind of out of the essence of that material creating some perspectival view. What is quote unquote like known or acknowledged or expressed by the objective construct of your brain is basically like an information state that is, again, quote unquote, like known by existence. And within this information state, there is this description of a person who is in a perspectival bubble and is experiencing whatever you're experiencing in that particular moment, including coming from a moment, being in a moment, and going to a moment, and including things like experiencing 3D space, the ability to traverse, the options available to you. There's some functional description of the objective object that you exist as, right? And that functional description is known by existence. And in our perspective, that functional description is that of like a human, right? Because we are subjective agents basically like existing through this content of existence. And then we observe basically other humans, and then we see their structure in our conscious perspectival context, and we like make assumptions about like the functional behavior and agentic properties of that person, when in reality, like it's not that those agentic properties and those agentic functional behaviors are what like coalesces the consciousness inside of them. Rather, those are the downstream effects of having a behavioral or functional or like control hierarchy describes within it basically of being single, individuated from the universe, traversing through time, traversing through options, and kind of like always anticipating the next moment in a way that allows you to like traverse through basically your world line because you are centered in that particular spot in the world line. So instead of that kind of like phenomenological precursor or prior being built into matter and physics itself, we're moving away from matter and physics actually being this like distinct layered substrate of stuff, and it's just everything all at once instantaneously. And then within everything all at once instantaneously, in this kind of like abstract information lattice that we happen to be basically like inferring from the data that we are experiencing as we are, in my description, via illusion, traversing through time, right? So we are basically indefinitely stuck in every moment that we exist in, but because every moment we exist in has the perception of having come from a moment and then going into the next moment, when existence all at once acknowledges our entire world line, it basically like creates this individual who feels as though they traverse that entire world line, because at every granular, like we take some range chunk that is not so large, like 10 seconds is not a single moment, and 0.005 seconds is not a single moment, but somewhere between those two granular ranges, there is what's described as like a human moment that you're currently in right now. That is not arising out of this essence of consciousness. I mean, we can describe like a model of consciousness that uses that as kind of like a substrate. What this changes for us is that we would say that an atom or an electron is different in the way it experiences consciousness, because the information that an atom or an electron, from our best, gathering of the data about it, does not present a system which, if known by existence, describes within it some individuated perspective that we would find common to our own experience of existence, right? And so in a way, I'm kind of like on the fence about panpsychism, because I'm kind of innately implying that all matter is really like an information description that is known by existence, and in that way it carries with it this kind of innate capacity to provide consciousness. But I think information doesn't innately or inherently describe a conscious experience. Rather, the act of being known by existence allows something to exist. And so if there is information that exists within all of existence that describes an individuated self or a sense of self or a perspective or a functional agent operating through a particular possibility space, then that information that is known is then described to be like experience, because that's what the information is describing, right? And so we're no longer looking at like a particular set of functions or behaviors in order to determine what is or what is not actually experiencing this like internal individuated sense of self that is like meaningful in some sort of ethical or moral sense. We're now just talking about like, can we find functional structures that exhibit basically like a coherent ability to describing within that system itself in a way that's individuated from everything else, and then operating on that category of self in a way that's like relative to the world that it's also describing and simulating. You have all of the cells as like the ground layer, the substrate is basically all the cells in your brain interacting, right? And then on top of that, you basically have, I'm taking a lot of stuff from Josha Bach, but you basically have like this software protocol that is operating on top of it, right? At like a different granular layer of control, that once these cells have kind of gone through that phase shift of now being in alignment towards the orchestration of this organism at that level, at that granularity of like basically categorization of things, right? It's then operating on those categorizations, and part of that categorization is like itself, the world. The hard problem of consciousness always falls into this discussion about like how consciousness and matter are related. And I think that that's like a red herring, because I think that you fail to like step back from the real situation that's happening, which is that we're all just like in this phenomenological bubble, imagining things and then trying to like predict what the phenomenological bubble of something else is. If we do that, then we just fall into all sorts of issues, unless we have some kind of like metaphysical frame to kind of explain ourselves very effectively, while also limiting us from basically containing every functional behavior that we can observe into consciousness. Basically, everything has some perspective, what I call a perspectival context, right? And so that's basically when existence knows everything all at once instantaneously. We can pretend to know what it's like to take just some small circle around a part of that known existence and then say there's like a perspective that is described to be known here, right? And so that's like the important separation that I'm trying to express. It's not that there is like some physical objective thing there that is conscious. Rather, there is some physical objective thing there that is describing a state of something that happens to know about the information that it exists within and it's experiencing. And because of that description, it's then known by existence to exist. So it's kind of like this as if, again, stealing from Josha Bach, experience of being a self where you were simulating to such a high granularity what it would be like if you were experiencing a moment across the world line. And then once you simulate that well enough, simulation at some granularity, like it's like similar to like the Nyquist sampling rate, where if you sample at a Nyquist rate, then you can completely recreate the original signal without any kind of lossiness to that signal. But my point is that, like, I don't know what my point was, but yeah, hopefully this was illuminating or something. I don't know.